Welcome to another special edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint. And in today's video, it's going to be a part two of our study of probably the most well-known edition of the Greek Old Testament, the Rahlfs-Hanhart Septuaginta. In the prior video, I introduced who Rahlfs is and who Hanhart is and where this came from, and a little bit of background about it. But in today's video, we're going to roll up our sleeves and study how to make use of it. And I won't be able to cover everything necessarily because it's quite complex, but I'll at least give you some pointers on how to get started with this very important edition. Now, if you open up to a page here, I've just chosen one of the minor prophets. This is the basic layout of how it looks on the inside. So you'll see that typically there will be a title up at the top. So this is the book of Micah or Michaias. And you'll have running chapter and verse numbers as is standard for any Bible. And as you look at the page, you'll see that the verse numbers are typically going to be listed not only in the left or right margin, depending on which side of the page you're looking at. You can see the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 there. But those will also be found within the text itself, which is actually a pretty nice feature to help you find where you want to be. I kind of wish other Bible editions did that as well. Even though it makes it slightly more cluttered, it's nice to be able to find where you want to be on the page there very quickly in the left-hand or right-hand margin. Now, if you look at the page itself, if you're used to, say, the UBS edition of the Greek New Testament, or even the Nestle Aland edition of the Greek New Testament, you're used to seeing lots of stuff within the text. That would be footnote numbers or interesting symbols like that for an insertion or little omission markings and so forth. But if you look at the Rahlfs-Hanhart, you won't notice any of that. It's a very clean presentation of the text. Even though in the prior video I mentioned that I don't love the typography, I do love how the text itself is rather clean. So you may be wondering, if this is a critical edition, how are we going to make sense of where textual variants and that kind of stuff are if we don't have little footnotes cluttering up the text? So if we take a look at the bottom of the page, in the primary apparatus, that's where you're going to find all the stuff you're looking for. And so instead of putting various footnote indicators within the text, what Rahlfs does, and the Hanhart revised edition does the same, is you'll pick a lemma, which is a portion of the text, from somewhere up on the page. This would be from verse 2, eulabes, and we'll take a look at this more closely in a bit. So they'll copy a portion of the text down into this apparatus, and then they will mention the variants out to the right of that. And so this is another example from verse 3. Apparently there's a variant for elaleisen, and here's what it's going to be, and so on. Or if you look at verse 8, there's apparently a variant for kurios, and so you'll see information about that. Or even to make it more clear, if you look at verse 14, there is a variant for rhabdo, and so we can find it up here. Let's erase some stuff. You can barely see it on the screen, but it's rhabdo here. And so they're telling you, all right, let's tell you what some of the variants are for that particular word. So that's the basic premise. And the Göttingen editions actually work very similarly. And in fact, some of the New Testament editions do this as well. Notably, the Tyndale House edition uses the same kind of format where you'll just copy a portion or the lemma that you're talking about, and you'll put it down in the apparatus, and then you'll provide the text critical information. But what is all this stuff? What are these letters? What is that? What is this little cross mark? What are these things? Well, let's take a look in further detail. Let's begin by taking a look at the main witnesses or manuscripts, although it's not limited to just manuscripts, that went into producing this edition. I covered this last time, but the big three that Rahlfs used are B, S, and A. Now, those don't show up across all the books, because some of the books of the Bible may not be in some of these manuscripts. But Rahlfs even says in his intro that this is primarily based on the text of Codex Vaticanus, which looks something like this, which dates to the 4th century. That's B. Also Codex Sinaiticus, and that's a glimpse of what that looks like. That's also 4th century, but a little bit later than Vaticanus. And we've done videos on both of those thus far in Daily Dose. And then A is Codex Alexandrinus, dating to about the 5th century. And down the road, I hope to get into Codex Alexandrinus. Those are the big three. However, there are three other main ones. It's not limited to this, but these are the main ones that, especially Hanhart, added a lot of evidence from these, or at least made it more clear based on the original edition by Rahlfs. And so C is going to be Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, which you may be familiar with from the New Testament side as well, because it includes both portions of the Old and the New. Dates to about the 5th century, and it's called Rescriptus because the text was rewritten. The undertext, which you can see here and kind of here, is a majuscule, typical format that we might see in Sinaiticus or something like that. And that's the biblical text, but it had been rewritten with some other writing on top of it. And down the road, I'll get into what Ephraemi Rescriptus looks like. And so that is also, to the extent that you can expose that underlying text, this is also a very famous witness to both the Greek Old Testament and the New Testament. It shows up a lot in your critical edition of the New Testament. Q has nothing to do with the synoptic problem, if you're used to that on the New Testament side. It is Codex Martialianus, which is from the 6th century, and it's a very different paleography. We'll cover it down the road, but that's a glimpse of what it looks like. And then lastly, V, which is Codex Venetus Graecus. This is from about the 8th century, and that is a glimpse from Job of what it looks like. So these are the other 3 main ones that will show up at various points in the apparatus of Rahlfs-Hanhart. 2 other capital letters basically are useful to point out. The first one is an italicized O here, and that represents the column of Origen's hexapla, that is his edited text based on what he is both doing in terms of the Old Greek and then various markups and so forth that he does. I'm going to get into the hexapla down the road in a sequence of daily doses. So you can look it up online, but I'll do some videos on that down the road. So that's going to be marked with a scripted O, and then the scripted L represents the Lucianic recension, also known as, probably more commonly these days, the Antiochene recension, which I'll also cover down the road. So those are going to be the main witnesses that you'll see. Again, you're not going to see them on every page because a given book may not exist in one of those, but those are the typical manuscripts or witnesses that you'll see in that bottom apparatus. Well, what about other symbols? Let's talk about some other things that you'll see in the critical apparatus as you make your way through it. Now, there's a lot of them. I'm not going to hit them all. I'm going to hit the main ones that you need to be familiar with. The first is an asterisk, and that's going to indicate the original reading of a given manuscript, like Alexandrinus or what have you. That's what the scribe of that manuscript originally wrote before perhaps it was edited or erased or marked up or something like that later. They'll typically use the asterisk, though, only if there's something going on with that reading, if it's been corrected in some way. Otherwise, you just don't need the asterisk or the star there. You'll just leave it as the standard letter like S or A or what have you. Next, we have C, and that is the correction to a given reading, either by that scribe itself, so far as we can figure that out, or a later corrector. You'll typically see that as a superscript next to any given manuscript letter like Q or what have you. So C stands for correction or corrector. S stands for, and this is not super common, you won't typically see this except for in certain parts, but this is a supplementary addition to a manuscript. So there's certain times where maybe a page is lost in a given manuscript and it was added back later, or I don't know, an additional section that's been added by a later scribe to flesh things out. Typically, these are not going to be terribly helpful text critically because they'll be oftentimes centuries later than the original, but sometimes Rahlfs will point those out. Next, we have TXT, and that is typically just an abbreviation for what the editors here, Rahlfs-Hanhart, believe to be the standard text, like the original Greek text of a manuscript, or the original text in a given manuscript. You're not going to see that one super often, but they sometimes will use that to clarify some things. Next, you might see MG, which references a reading in the margin of a manuscript as opposed to in the text of the manuscript itself. And so you might see it in the left margin, the right margin, the top, the bottom, something like that. You will occasionally see a sort of cross symbol here, and I'm not entirely sure why they do this, to be honest, but they will sometimes indicate that a specific reading, a textual variant, is only found, or at least primarily found, in the manuscript that it shows up. So like Sinaiticus with that little cross indicates that whatever this word or phrase is, so far as we can tell, shows up only in Sinaiticus. It may be found in some later minuscules. Rahlfs doesn't show that data. We'll see that in the Göttingen editions. So it's mainly or primarily found in this given manuscript. So it's, in a certain sense, perhaps a unique reading as opposed to something that might be shared by multiple scribes. So that's sometimes important information. The plus sign, this one's quite important. That shows that relative to the text they're showing, that they believe is the original text, the Old Greek, a word or more words, plural words, have been added. We call this a plus. That has been added, or it's a longer reading, perhaps in Marshallianus or what have you. So we'll see some examples of that. And then the greater than sign, a little bit of an interesting one. I suppose they didn't want to use a minus sign because that might be a little bit confusing. This indicates words that have been omitted. It's a minus relative, again, to the reconstructed critical text. So it's missing in a given manuscript. Now, that doesn't mean that it was removed. That other manuscript may very well be correct. But Rahlfs, at least in his edition, doesn't believe that it is. Next, you have TR with a period. That is an abbreviation for a transposition of words. That's when words are rearranged. So instead of perhaps the wording ABC, it'll instead be CBA or something along those lines. Next, you have PR, and that means that whatever the variant reading that we're talking about, could be adding an article or something like that, precedes the text in the critical edition. It shows up prior to whatever the lemma is that they have shown you in the apparatus. So that is an important thing to know because it's used quite a bit. And then PRO, which is a Latin term, means that the variant reading is standing in place of whatever the critical text is or the lemma. So it's a sort of substitution, if you will. Then we have this right square bracket that separates the lemma from the series of variants that are mentioned. And we'll show you that here in a second, although I just mentioned it a second ago. The vertical bar separates subvariants. So let's say you have a given variant for a word like A, you got the little bracket here, and let's say you have option 1, which is X, Y, Z, and let's say there's a different option, a different manuscript that's P, D, Q or something like that. It'll be separated by that vertical bar. To show you that, hey, these are the two different subvariants for this word, whatever that might be. And I mean, by A, I just mean a hypothetical example. That wasn't meant to be Alexandrinus. And then lastly, the double vertical bar separates individual variants. A lot of times Rahlfs will just mention one variant in a given verse, but if there's more than one, he'll separate those by that double vertical bar. So these are all the very important symbols and other types of markup that you need to be familiar with. There are others, but those are the ones that we'll focus on. Now let's go back to our critical apparatus and test drive this a bit and see how it works. Let's begin with this very first one on the page, Eulabes here. If you look at Micah 7:2 from Rahlfs, and this is just a portion of it, and this is farther up on the page, but it's not shown on the screen, you'll see it's apollolen Eulabes apotes geis, and that can be translated for the pious, that's what Eulabes is, has perished from the land. And so what Rahlfs does is takes this word and he puts it right here as the lemma. And then he puts that right bracket there to show you, okay, let me give you a list of variants for that word. And he mentions that the variant reading is Eusebes as opposed to Eulabes, and it's found in B, that's Vaticanus, and it's by the original scribe, and it appears to be unique to that scribe who has given that reading. In other words, the B star here, Vaticanus, is apollolen Eusebes as opposed to Eulabes. You see the difference there. Apotes geis and Eusebes is godliness or something like that. Well, what does it actually look like in the manuscript? So this is a little excerpt from Vaticanus, and you see that here is the Eusebes right there. Of course, it's in the majuscule script, but it matches up with Eusebes, apotes geis. So Rahlfs has correctly captured that. But the reason why he mentions that is the original scribe with that asterisk is that the corrector has reverted it back to Eulabes there. And this is probably done later, but he changes it to a lambda alpha to correct it. And so that's why Rahlfs is trying to tell you in a very compact way that the original scribe read Eusebes and a later corrector changed it back to Eulabes. And so you can tell that there a lot of really interesting information is captured with that, and that gives you the sense of, okay, the original Scribe Vaticanus, which is the earliest layer of the tradition here, thinks it's this. Pretty much everyone else thinks it's Eulabes, and in fact a later corrector agreed with that, and so that will help you make text-critical decisions. But it's really quite interesting to see how it gets unpacked in the actual manuscript itself. So that's 7.2, and that's the only one in that particular verse that Rahlfs shows. That's why he does the double bar here and then goes to verse 3. So there's nothing else in verse 2 worthy of mentioning, although I'm sure if we looked at a bigger critical edition, there would be other options. Let's take a look at another one. If you look at this is verse 6 here, and it's Andros Pontes. And in fact, this is Micah 7:6. It's Ekthroi Andros Pontes. That's the broader sub-clause, if you want to call it that. And that's all the enemies of a man. And he puts that bracket there. This is also read in L, which we talked about. That's the Lucianic or Antiochene recension, which we'll talk about down the road. And here's what he tells us. It is transposed in Vaticanus, which means the words are rearranged, specifically these two words. So let's take a look at that. In Vaticanus, we see Ekthroi, that checks out. But instead of Andros Pontes, we have Pontes Andros. You see how they are transposed, they are switched. And if you look it up, here's what it looks like. You'll see the Ekthroi here, then you see Pontes and Andros. So it matches exactly what Rahlfs has told us, as opposed to what he thinks is the original Greek text. And apparently this transposition is also unique to Vaticanus. It seems to be a singular reading in that manuscript. So that's what the TR means, and that's what it looks like in the wild. But sticking with this same variant, we can move a little bit further. Notice that what he does here, given the lemma Andros Pontes, he says, all right, Andros, just taking that first word in this subsection here, is omitted. That's that greater than sign. It's omitted in Alexandrinus, Martialianus, and a different one, W, which is, I didn't mention earlier, but is a manuscript that we won't get into in this particular video. So what does that look like specifically in Martialianus? What does he mean by that? Well, if you look it up, you'll see that we have Ekthroi here. It takes a little bit of time to get used to the handwriting there. So here's the Ekthroi. Skipping that, and then he goes on to Pontes. So you have the Pontes here. Notice that the original hand has omitted Andros, and so it actually reads like this, and then it continues with hoi Andres here. That's the rest of the sentence. So the original scribe of Martialianus has left out that Andros, that man word. But here's something interesting that Rahlfs does not include. And my guess is it's because the coverage of the textual variants, especially from Martialianus or Q, wasn't as thorough as it will eventually become in the fuller Göttingen edition. And so Rahlfs leaves out the fact that a later scribe adds Andros in the margin. You see that? It doesn't match the handwriting. This is clearly later. And so really what Rahlfs should have done is said it was Q star that lacks the, that has omitted the Andros, and then we can deduce that someone has added it later. So my guess is that's just a symptom of the fact that it's an incomplete semi-critical apparatus, but pretty interesting to take a look at in the wild. Let's do one more. If we look down here at verse 12, there's a couple things we want to point out. And in Micah 7:12, you have Patamu, Syrias, Hemera, Hudatas, Kai, Thorubu, and so we'll begin with the river of Syria, and you'll notice that what Rahlfs says is Syrias here, which matches up here. You see how those connect, is omitted in B and in C, which I didn't cover. That's not the manuscript C. This is a catena of the 12 prophets, a fairly minor thing, so I didn't get into it earlier. So it's omitted in B. So let's find that. This is Vaticanus again. Here's Patamu. So you see that goes back over here, right here. But it goes straight to Kai. It's missing this Syrias. And so right here is where we would have expected it, but it has been omitted, which is why Rahlfs mentions that. So that's an omission in Vaticanus. But it even gets more interesting for Vaticanus. You'll notice that instead of the river of Syria, the day of water, and so forth, which you see right here as this new lemma, as it is read in Q and in W, notice now we have a different variant. It's a lengthy one, actually. Kai, apothalases, from the sea until the sea, and from the mountain until the mountain. Notice that is what is read in B, and as well as that Catena manuscript. That's what's read in B. But he also notes that the corrector to Vaticanus omits this article before the second orus. So let's see what that looks like. Back to Potamu here, fair enough. It's missing the Syria. And then instead of this whole hemera, hudatas, blah, 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 he goes kai, apa, thalases, heus, thalases. So from the sea to the sea. Kai, apa, orus, heos. So far, so good. You see, if you're able to track along, we got thalases, heos, thalases, kai, apa, orus, heos. That's where we are. The original scribe put 2 there. That's this 2. And then we have the orus. But notice it was not re-inked, and in fact, the corrector not only did not re-ink it, but he put deletion dots above it, implying that he didn't think it should be there. And so that's what this little reference is getting at. It's omitted in B corrector, not only with the lack of re-inking, you'd see how it's fainter there, but also with the dots above it. So there's a lot. Again, this is a pretty interesting one because there's so many moving parts, but what Rahlfs has tried to do in the apparatus is give you a ton of information in a very compressed way. And that's probably enough to show you, but you can see, ek here is found. This is in verse 13. In the text that Rahlfs thinks is correct, but it's apa and others, so that's a replacement if you want to call it that. You see Hrabdo that we looked at previously, it's added, or there's a plus of Fulane, tribe there, or Fules in the genitive. So that's how you make sense of the apparatus. So I hope this has been a helpful introduction, a bit of a whirlwind tour. There's a lot going on in Rahlfs, but hopefully this at least gets you thinking about how to make sense of it, because it is a bit different than the New Testament. The basic premise is the same, but the way you're going to use it is going to be somewhat different. So hopefully you've enjoyed this.